Some properties don't stay on the market long because they're desirable. Others linger for years because everyone knows better than to touch them. In the autumn of 1883, a widower named Thomas Brennan learned the difference between a bargain and a burden when he purchased 180 acres of Illinois farmland for $250, barely enough to buy 3 good plow horses. The property came with a 2-story farmhouse, a chicken coop, and a history so dark that the bank manager apologized while handing over the deed. The locals called it the Whitmore Farm, though most folks just referred to it as that God-forsaken place near the creek bend. The county clerk had stammered through the paperwork, and the previous owner's lawyer conducted the entire transaction by mail, refusing to meet in person. Thomas figured they were all caught up in small-town gossip and superstition. He'd spent 23 years working farmland in Ohio, had survived the war, watched cholera take his wife and infant daughter, and buried his father last spring. He didn't have patience for ghost tales or whispered warnings. What he did have was emptiness that needed filling and a small inheritance that wouldn't last forever. $250 for established farmland, with a standing house and barn, that was an opportunity a practical man couldn't ignore, even if that practical man's heart had gone cold as January frost. But the moment his chestnut mare, Copper, set foot on that land, Thomas felt something shift in the air. Horses possess a sixth sense that humans have bred out of themselves through civilization and stubbornness. They feel storms coming 3 days early, sense water underground, and know when death is near before the doctor's even been called. Thomas had always trusted Copper's instincts more than most people's opinions, and Copper's ears were pinned flat against her skull before they'd even passed the property line. The gate itself hung crooked, one hinge completely rusted through, the other barely holding. The wooden posts were weathered grey as tombstones. Beyond it stood a farmhouse that might have been handsome once, with green shutters and a wraparound porch, but time and neglect had stripped away any charm. The paint peeled in long curls, the shutters hung at odd angles, and the porch steps sagged dangerously in the middle. The windows were so thick with grime that Thomas couldn't see inside, and the front door stood partially open, creaking with each gust of wind. The barn, surprisingly, looked more stable than the house. Its red paint had faded to dull rust, but the structure seemed sound, and when Thomas dismounted to investigate, he found the stalls still had decent straw bedding, though it smelled faintly of mildew and something else he couldn't quite place. 60 yards past the barn, almost hidden by overgrown blackberry brambles and wild roses, stood something Thomas hadn't been told about during the sale. A root cellar, built into the hillside, with a heavy wooden door reinforced by iron straps. 3 thick chains wrapped around it, secured by padlocks so old they'd turned green with verdigris. Thomas stood staring at it, hands on his hips, wondering what kind of root cellar needed to be locked up tighter than a bank vault. The real estate agent, a nervous woman named Ida Pritchard, hadn't left her buggy. Her horses were dancing sideways, foam specking their bits, clearly eager to leave. "Mrs. Pritchard," Thomas called, pointing toward the cellar. "What's that building secured for?" Ida pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, despite the mild weather. "Couldn't say, Mr. Brennan. The Whitmore family never mentioned it in the listing. I'd advise leaving it be." "That right?" Thomas said, studying her pale face. "And why would that be?" She looked away toward the horizon where dark clouds were gathering. "Some doors are locked for good reason. The price is still $250. Papers are ready at the bank. They'll sign tonight, if you will." That should have given Thomas pause, should have sent him riding back to town with questions instead of signatures. But grief makes men reckless in ways they don't recognize until it's too late. He'd lost everything that mattered. What was one more risk? He signed the papers that evening by lamplight in the bank's back office. The Whitmore family's representative, a lawyer from Springfield, conducted the transaction without ever meeting Thomas's eyes. The man's hands shook as he blotted the ink, and he left the building before Thomas had even stood up from the table. 6 days later, Thomas returned with copper and a wagon full of supplies. He'd spent the intervening time in town gathering what he'd need to make the place livable: a new mattress, tools, seeds for spring planting, enough flour and bacon to last through winter. He'd also ask questions, careful and casual, about the Whitmore family. What he learned made his neck prickle. The Whitmores had been prosperous farmers, well respected, until their eldest son, Jacob, had disappeared without a trace in the winter of 1871. Some said he'd run off to avoid a scandal involving a merchant's daughter. Others whispered darker theories involving debts to the wrong people. Jacob's mother had searched for him obsessively until her mind broke like a frozen water pump. She died in an asylum 3 years later. His father had sold the farm and moved to California, abandoning everything: furniture, tools, even family photographs. No one had lived on the property since. When Thomas drove the wagon up the muddy road toward the house, Copper balked again, just like before. The mare planted her hooves and refused to move, muscles quivering, nostrils flaring. "Come on, girl," Thomas murmured, keeping his voice steady. "Nothing here but wind and memories." But Copper wouldn't budge, her attention locked on that root cellar half hidden in the brambles. Her ears swiveled forward, then back, then forward again, listening to something Thomas couldn't hear. He climbed down from the wagon, took her bridle, and tried leading her by hand. She followed reluctantly, each step measured and careful, head turned constantly toward that locked door. It wasn't fear exactly, more like intense focus, the way she'd act when she sensed a snake in the grass or heard a fox prowling near the chicken coop back in Ohio. "Easy now," Thomas said, stroking her neck. "Whatever's got your attention can wait." He managed to get her settled in the barn with fresh water and oats, but even then she kept turning toward the western wall, the one that faced the root cellar. Her tail swished nervously, and she pawed the ground twice, a behavior Thomas had seen her do only once before, the night before his wife passed. That first evening, Thomas swept out the house and set up a basic camp in what had been the kitchen. The pump still worked, though the water ran rust-colored for several minutes before clearing. He lit a fire in the old stove, made coffee, and tried to convince himself he'd made a sound decision. The house groaned and settled around him, normal sounds for an old building, but they felt heavier somehow, weighted with unspoken history. He thought about those 3 padlocks, about the way Ida Pritchard had refused to look at the cellar, about how the lawyer's hands had trembled during the signing. Superstition, he told himself firmly. Country folk love their ghost stories. But sleep didn't come easy that night. He lay on his new mattress in the upstairs bedroom, listening to wind rattle the shutters and watching moonlight paint strange shadows across the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called 3 times, then went silent. And from the barn below, he heard Copper whinny once, sharp and urgent before falling quiet. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to remember his wife's face, but grief had started blurring the details, leaving him with impressions instead of memories. The curve of her smile, the sound of her humming while she worked, the weight of her hand in his, all of it fading like morning fog. Maybe that's why he'd come here, to this strange, locked-up farm. Maybe he was hoping that by starting completely over in a place with no memories, he could finally stop living in the past. Or maybe, some quiet voice whispered in the back of his mind, he'd come here because a man who's lost everything has nothing left to fear. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. There were still plenty of things to fear, he just hadn't found them yet. Morning broke grey and cold, with fog rolling thick across the fields, like something alive and searching. Thomas woke to the sound of Copper screaming, not the normal whinny of a hungry horse, but a sound of pure distress that sent him stumbling down the stairs, still pulling on his boots. He burst through the barn door to find her rearing against her stall, eyes rolling white, hooves striking the wooden boards with enough force to crack them. "Whoa! Whoa! Easy, girl!" Thomas shouted, but she didn't seem to hear him. Her attention was fixed on something beyond the barn wall, beyond his ability to see or understand. He managed to grab her halter, speaking low and steady, until she calmed enough to stop striking, but her whole body trembled like she'd been running for miles. He checked her over carefully, looking for injury or signs of colic, but found nothing wrong physically. It was her mind that had been disturbed, her instincts screaming warnings that Thomas's duller human senses couldn't pick up. He spent the morning doing what practical men do when faced with the inexplicable. He ignored it and focused on work. There were fences to mend, a chicken coop to repair, firewood to split for the coming winter. Hard labor had a way of quieting uncomfortable thoughts, and Thomas had always been a man who believed in keeping his hands busy and his mind focused on tangible problems. But by afternoon, as he was reinforcing the fence line near the property's eastern edge, he noticed something odd. Someone had carved marks into several of the fence posts, symbols that looked almost like letters but weren't quite. They'd been there a long time, weathered and faded, but deliberate. He traced one with his finger, trying to make sense of it, when Copper nickered behind him. He'd tied her nearby while he worked, and she was staring again toward that root cellar, ears forward, body tense. "What is it about that damn cellar?" Thomas muttered. He walked toward it, Copper following without being led, her hooves quiet on the soft earth. The chains looked even heavier up close, the padlocks ancient and solid. He pulled at one experimentally, but it held fast. The door itself was thick oak, reinforced with iron, built to keep something in or keep something out. He pressed his ear against it, feeling foolish even as he did so, and listened. Nothing, just silence and the smell of damp earth. But when he pulled away, Copper pushed her nose against the door and snorted, breath misting in the cool air. Then she began to paw at the ground directly in front of the entrance, same as she'd done in the barn, measured strikes with her right front hoof 3 times, then a pause, then 3 more. Thomas stepped back, watching her. He'd seen horses paw when they were impatient or frustrated, but this was different. This was purposeful, almost like she was trying to tell him something. "You think there's something under there, girl?" The mare stamped once more, then turned to look at him directly, and Thomas would have sworn on his dead wife's grave that he saw intelligence in those dark eyes, understanding and urgency. He made a decision then, one he'd probably regret. Tomorrow, he'd ride into town and get bolt cutters. He'd see what was locked up so tight that a family would abandon their entire property rather than deal with it. That evening, he made a simple supper of beans and salt pork, eating alone at the scarred kitchen table while wind whistled through gaps in the window frames. He found a Bible in one of the cupboards, pages yellowed and brittle, with a family tree written on the inside cover. The Whitmore family line stretched back 3 generations, names and dates recorded in careful script. At the bottom, in shakier handwriting, someone had written, "Jacob Whitmore, born April 3rd, 1849. May God have mercy on his soul." Not died, Thomas noticed. Not missing, just that strange prayer for mercy. He slept poorly again that night, drifting in and out of dreams, where his wife called to him from somewhere he couldn't reach, her voice growing fainter each time he tried to follow. He woke just before dawn, to find Copper had somehow gotten out of her stall, something she'd never done before, and was standing outside the house, staring at the root cellar in the growing light. The next morning, Thomas rode into town, a place called Millbrook that consisted of 1 main street, 2 churches, a general store, and a blacksmith shop that doubled as the town's informal gathering place. He tied Copper outside the store and went in, nodding to the shopkeeper, an elderly man named Walter Hayes, who'd been pleasant enough during Thomas's previous visits. "Morning, Mr. Brennan," Walter said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Getting settled in all right?" "Well enough," Thomas replied. "Need some tools, though. You carry bolt cutters." The shopkeeper's smile froze. "Bolt cutters? What for, if you don't mind my asking?" "Got some old chains need removing on my property. Figured I'd clear out that root cellar. See if there's anything useful stored inside." The store went quiet. Thomas hadn't noticed, but 3 other customers had been browsing the shelves, and now all of them were staring at him. An older woman clutched her shopping basket tighter and hurried out without buying anything. Walter set down the cloth he'd been holding, his weathered face going serious. "Mr. Brennan, I'm going to give you some advice." And I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's offered. Leave that cellar alone." "Why?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice level. "Because some things are locked up for good reason," Walter said. "The Whitmore family, they were good people before what happened. Before their son disappeared." The shopkeeper glanced at the remaining customers, then lowered his voice. "It wasn't just that he disappeared, Mr. Brennan. It was how, and what his mother found before she lost her mind." Thomas leaned against the counter. "I'm listening." Walter hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Jacob Whitmore was a troubled boy. Smart, but troubled. His father caught him doing things, cruel things to animals when he was young. They thought he'd grow out of it, but he only got better at hiding it. Then people started going missing. Not locals, mind you. Drifters, travelers passing through. 3 in the span of 2 years. Nobody connected it to Jacob at first. Why would they? He was a farmer's son, well-spoken, attended church every Sunday. "What happened?" Thomas asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. Winter of 1871, a peddler came through town selling tin goods and medicines. Nice fellow, had a wife and baby waiting for him back in Indiana. He stopped at the Whitmore farm to water his horse and was never seen again. His wagon was found a week later, abandoned on the road 5 miles south, horse still hitched, but half-starved. No sign of the peddler anywhere. Walter paused, his hands trembling slightly. Jacob's mother, Sarah, she started noticing things after that. Her son washing clothes in the middle of the night, tools going missing from the barn, strange smells coming from that root cellar which Jacob had taken over for his own use. Said he was experimenting with new food preservation methods, learning to cure meat properly. His father believed him, wanted to believe him, but Sarah, she had a mother's instinct. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. She went into the cellar. She tried to, Walter said quietly. Found it locked up with those chains. Confronted Jacob about it, and he disappeared that very night. Took his horse and rode off, never came back. When they finally broke into the cellar, Sarah saw something in there that shattered her mind. She never spoke clearly again, just screamed and cried about pieces and preserving and how her baby boy had become something unholy. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Thomas straightened, processing what he'd heard. "What did they find in the cellar?" "Don't know," Walter admitted. Jacob's father sealed it back up before anyone else could see, wrapped it in those chains, and never spoke of it again. Sold the property through a lawyer and left Illinois entirely. Far as I know, nobody's opened that cellar in 12 years. Thomas bought the bolt cutters anyway, along with a sturdy shovel and a lantern with extra oil. Walter tried one more time to dissuade him, but Thomas was decided. He'd spent 2 years living in the shadow of death and grief, and he wasn't about to let old ghost stories and town gossip dictate how he lived what remained of his life. Besides, Copper knew something. Animals didn't lie or exaggerate or get caught up in hysteria. If his horse thought there was something important in that cellar, something that needed to be found, then Thomas was going to trust that instinct over human fear. He rode back to the farm as afternoon shadows stretched long across the fields. Copper moved differently now, with purpose instead of reluctance, as if she understood that things were finally moving towards some kind of resolution. Thomas unsaddled her and checked the bolt cutters, testing their strength against a piece of scrap metal. They'd do the job. He looked toward the root cellar, half hidden in brambles, wrapped in chains and secrets, and 12 years of silence. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow at first light, when he was rested and clear-headed, he'd cut those locks and see what Jacob Whitmore had hidden away, what his mother had seen that had destroyed her sanity, what had been buried here longer than Thomas had been a widower, longer than his daughter had been dead, longer than he'd carried this hollow ache in his chest where his heart used to be. He walked back to the house as darkness fell, made himself supper, and tried not to think about what morning would bring. But that night, he dreamed of his wife again, and this time she wasn't calling to him. She was warning him. Her lips formed words he couldn't hear. Her hands reached out as if to pull him back from something dangerous. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, and lay in the darkness listening to Copper move restlessly in the barn below. Whatever was coming, he'd face it the same way he'd faced everything else since losing his family, with grim determination and nothing left to lose. Before we continue to Block 3, I want to ask you something. What do you think Thomas is going to find in that cellar? Drop your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. This story is just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss the secrets that are about to be uncovered. If you're enjoying this tale of mystery and redemption, let me know by leaving a comment. Your support keeps these stories coming, and I read every single comment. Now, let's find out what's been locked away for 12 long years. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning where frost clung to every blade of grass and your breath hung in the air like smoke. Thomas dressed slowly, pulling on his heaviest work shirt and coat, then strapped his father's old Colt revolver to his hip. He wasn't sure why he felt the need for a weapon, but instinct told him to be prepared for anything. Copper was already awake when he entered the barn, standing alert in her stall, ears pricked forward. She nickered softly when she saw him, a sound almost like approval. "All right, girl," Thomas said, checking her over quickly. "Let's see what you've been trying to tell me." He gathered the bolt cutters, the shovel, and the lantern, loading them into a canvas sack. The walk to the root cellar felt longer than it should have. Each step weighted with the knowledge that he was about to cross a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees, and birds had gone oddly quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The chains were cold to the touch, heavy and solid. Thomas positioned the bolt cutters around the first padlock and squeezed with all his strength. The lock resisted, then suddenly gave way with a sharp crack that echoed across the empty fields. Copper stamped her approval from where she stood nearby, watching intently. The second lock broke easier, and the third practically fell apart in his hands, rust having done half the work over the years. Thomas unwrapped the chains carefully, letting them fall in a heavy coil at his feet. They hit the ground with a sound like distant thunder. He stood before the door, hand on the iron handle, and paused. This was the moment. Whatever lay beyond this threshold had driven Sarah Whitmore insane, had caused her husband to abandon everything he'd built, had kept an entire town whispering in fear for over a decade. Part of him, the sensible part that had kept him alive through war and loss and hardship, urged him to walk away. To wrap those chains back up, sell the property, and move somewhere with less history and fewer shadows. But Thomas had learned something in the 2 years since his wife died. The only thing worse than facing terrible truths was living in the prison of not knowing. Ignorance wasn't bliss. It was just another kind of suffering. He pulled the door open. The hinges screamed in protest, sending a flock of crows bursting from nearby trees in an explosion of black wings and harsh cries. The smell hit him immediately, not the stench of decay he'd been expecting, but something else entirely. Dust, old wood, and beneath it all a faint chemical smell like lye soap or preserving solution. Thomas lit the lantern and held it high, descending the stone steps carefully. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, maybe 15 feet square, with a ceiling just tall enough for him to stand upright. As his eyes adjusted to the lamplight, he saw that the space had been converted into something that was definitely not meant for storing vegetables. Wooden shelves lined 3 walls, and on those shelves sat rows of glass jars, dozens of them, maybe more than 100. His first thought was that Jacob had indeed been preserving food, that the town's fears had been overblown. Then he looked closer at the contents of those jars, and his blood went cold. They weren't pickles or preserved fruit. They were specimens, anatomical specimens, suspended in clear liquid that had yellowed with age. And they were human. Thomas's stomach lurched, but he forced himself to keep looking, to understand what he was seeing. Small things, mostly. A hand, fingers curled as if grasping for something. An ear. Sections of tissue preserved and labeled in neat handwriting on tags tied to each jar. Some jars contained things he couldn't immediately identify, organs perhaps, or muscle samples. Each label bore a date and a set of initials. 3 different sets of initials, he counted. 3 people. On a workbench in the center of the room lay leather-bound journals, their pages stiff with age but still legible. Thomas set the lantern down with a shaking hand and opened the first one. The handwriting was precise, almost beautiful, each letter formed with careful attention. It was the penmanship of someone educated, someone methodical, someone utterly mad. June 14th, 1869, the first entry began. Subject A arrived at the property seeking work. Male, approximately 35 years of age, in good health. I have been studying father's veterinary texts and find myself curious about the variations in human anatomy compared to livestock. If one can learn to preserve animal tissue for later study, surely the same principles apply to human specimens. I've prepared the cellar laboratory and acquired the necessary chemicals. Tomorrow, I begin my research. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat, but he kept reading, compelled by horrified fascination. Jacob Whitmore had documented everything. The abduction of 3 people over 2 years, the experiments he conducted, the preservation techniques he perfected. He wrote about it all with the detached clinical language of a scientist observing insects, showing no remorse, no recognition that his subjects had been human beings with lives and families and futures. The second journal detailed Jacob's growing paranoia as his mother began to suspect something was wrong. He wrote about considering disposing of his collection, but couldn't bring himself to destroy what he considered his life's work. The final entry was dated December 8, 1871, 2 days before he disappeared. Mother knows. I saw it in her eyes at breakfast this morning. She's going to tell father, or worse, bring the sheriff. I cannot allow my research to be destroyed by small minds who cannot comprehend the pursuit of knowledge. Tonight, I will take what specimens I can carry and ride for California. Perhaps there, in a larger city, I can find others who understand the importance of scientific advancement. I leave the rest here, sealed away. Someday, someone with the intellect to appreciate this work will find it. Thomas closed the journal with trembling hands, fighting the urge to vomit. He'd found the answer to what happened to those missing travelers, found proof of murders that had gone unpunished for over a decade. But something didn't make sense. If Jacob had planned to run away to California, what had stopped him? Why had he never arrived, never been heard from again? He looked around the cellar one more time, lantern light throwing grotesque shadows across those rows of preserved specimens. Then he noticed something he'd missed before. In the far corner, partially hidden behind the shelves, the earthen floor looked disturbed. Not recently, but at some point someone had dug there and filled it back in, the soil a different color than the surrounding packed earth. Copper whinnied from outside, sharp and urgent. Thomas climbed the steps quickly, grateful for fresh air and sunlight, and found his horse pawing at the ground again, but not near the cellar door. She'd moved about 10 feet to the left, where the hillside sloped gently upward, and was striking the earth in that same measured pattern. 3 strikes, pause, 3 more. You telling me there's something buried here too, girl? Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. He retrieved the shovel and began to dig where copper indicated. The soil was soft, easier to move than it should have been, suggesting it had been disturbed before. He'd gone down about 3 feet when the shovel struck something solid, not rock, something that gave slightly under the impact. Thomas knelt and cleared away dirt with his hands, revealing fabric, rotten canvas, wrapped around something human-sized. His heart hammered as he uncovered more, working carefully now, treating this as what it was. A grave, an unmarked, hidden grave on his property, dug 12 years ago by someone who'd wanted to ensure this body was never found. It took him another hour to fully excavate. The canvas fell apart as he tried to lift it, revealing skeletal remains still partially clothed in decayed fabric. A man, judging by the size. Thomas sat back on his heels, breathing hard, and noticed something gleaming in the dirt near the skull. A pocket watch, tarnished but intact. He picked it up carefully, wiping away soil. The back was engraved, "To Jacob on your 18th birthday. May you always know the right time to do what's right. With love, Mother and Father, Thomas stared at the inscription, the pieces falling into place. Jacob Whitmore had never made it to California. He'd never escaped his crimes or continued his horrific research. Someone had stopped him, permanently, and buried him here within sight of his hidden laboratory. But who? Sarah Whitmore had been committed to an asylum shortly after Jacob disappeared, her mind shattered by what she'd discovered. His father had sealed the cellar, sold the property, and fled west. Which of them had done this, or had they done it together, parents executing their own son for crimes too terrible to bring before any earthly court? Thomas carefully wrapped the remains back in canvas, then climbed out of the hole. He stood there in the cold morning air, looking from the grave to the open cellar door, trying to decide what to do with this terrible knowledge. He could fill the hole back in, seal the cellar again, and pretend he'd never opened it, let sleeping horrors lie undisturbed, or he could ride into town, bring back the sheriff, and reveal everything, give those 3 murdered travelers whatever justice could still be served 12 years late, even if it meant exposing the Whitmore family's darkest secret and confirming every terrible rumor that had ever been whispered about this property. Copper nuzzled his shoulder, warm breath against his neck, and somehow that simple gesture of trust and companionship made the decision for him. Thomas had spent 2 years running from pain, hiding from his own grief, letting the ghosts of his past dictate his future. But maybe that's what this place needed, someone willing to face the ghosts head-on, to drag old secrets into the light no matter how ugly they were, to choose truth over comfortable ignorance. "All right, girl," he said, stroking Copper's neck. "We're going to do this right." He covered the grave temporarily with boards, closed and secured the cellar door, then saddled Copper and rode toward Millbrook. The sun had climbed higher now, burning off the morning frost, and the world looked almost peaceful. But Thomas carried the weight of what he'd discovered like stones in his pockets, heavy and undeniable. Sheriff Marcus Webb was in his office when Thomas arrived, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a grey beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He looked up from his paperwork as Thomas entered, his expression shifting from welcoming to wary as he read something in Thomas's face. "Mr. Brennan," he said slowly, setting down his pen, "you look like you've seen the devil himself." "Close enough," Thomas replied. "I need you to ride out to my property, Sheriff. I've found something you need to see. Several somethings, actually, and none of them good." The sheriff stood, hand moving instinctively to check his sidearm. "This about that root cellar Walter Hayes said you were planning to open?" "It is," Thomas confirmed, "and about a grave that nobody knew was there." Sheriff Webb's face went pale. "Lord have mercy. You'd better tell me everything." So Thomas did, standing in that small office while the town moved on outside, oblivious to the revelations being spoken within. He told about the jars, the journals, the documented murders, and finally about the body buried in sight of the cellar door, a body wearing Jacob Whitmore's pocket watch. When he finished, the sheriff sat down heavily, looking like he'd aged 10 years in as many minutes. "I always wondered," he said quietly. "When Jacob disappeared, I always wondered if maybe his parents had found out what he'd done. Sarah Whitmore was a gentle soul, but a mother protecting her community from her own child. That's a different kind of strength altogether." "What happens now?" Thomas asked. The sheriff stood, reaching for his hat. "Now we ride out there. I document everything, and then I have to figure out what kind of justice can still be served after 12 years. The victims deserve to be identified if possible, their families notified. As for Jacob, well, sounds like someone already saw to that justice, and I can't say I'm inclined to dig too deep into who." He paused at the door. "You did the right thing, Mr. Brennan, coming forward. Lots of men would have just sealed it all back up and tried to forget." Thomas thought about that as they rode back toward the farm together, the sheriff and 2 deputies following behind him. He supposed that was true. But he'd learned something important in these past few days. You couldn't outrun the past by pretending it didn't exist. The only way through darkness was straight ahead, with your eyes open and your conscience clear, trusting that truth, however terrible, was better than living with comfortable lies. The next 3 days passed in a blur of official proceedings and uncomfortable revelations. Sheriff Webb brought in a doctor from Springfield to examine the remains and the preserved specimens. A county judge arrived to oversee the investigation, along with a prosecutor who pored over Jacob's journals with a mixture of horror and grim fascination. Thomas's property became a crime scene more than a decade after the crimes had been committed. They worked carefully, documenting everything. The doctor confirmed that the skeletal remains were indeed Jacob Whitmore's, based on dental records his father had provided to a local physician years earlier. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the skull, a single, powerful blow that would have killed him instantly. "Merciful, at least," the doctor said quietly, speaking to Thomas on the porch while investigators worked below. "Quicker than what he gave his victims." The jars and journals provided enough information to identify 2 of the 3 missing people. A traveling peddler named Samuel Morrison, 42 years old, who'd left behind a wife and 3 children in Indiana. A prospector named William Chen, 27, whose family in San Francisco had reported him missing while he was traveling east. The 3rd victim, listed only as Subject A in Jacob's notes, remained unidentified, and likely always would be. Some ghosts, it seemed, would stay nameless. Throughout it all, Copper remained Thomas's steady companion, as if the mare understood that her human needed the comfort of her presence. She'd been the one to sense something wrong from the very beginning, the one whose instincts had pushed Thomas to investigate when every rational impulse told him to leave well enough alone. On the 4th day, after the investigators had finished their work and removed all the evidence, Sheriff Webb returned alone. He found Thomas in the barn, mucking out stalls and trying to return to some semblance of normal life. "Wanted to update you on where things stand," the sheriff said, leaning against the doorframe. "We've sent notifications to what family we could locate. Morrison's widow is still alive, living with her daughter in Ohio. She's been waiting 12 years for answers about what happened to her husband. At least now she'll have some closure, even if it's not the kind anyone wants." Thomas set down his pitchfork. "What about the Whitmores, Jacob's father? Died 6 years ago in Sacramento," Webb said. "Heart failure, according to the records we found. Never remarried, never spoke about his past. As for Sarah, she passed in that asylum in 1874, still lost in whatever darkness her mind had retreated to." The sheriff pulled out his pipe, tamping tobacco into it thoughtfully. "The judge has decided not to pursue charges against anyone in Jacob's death. Given the circumstances, the time that's passed, and the fact that whoever did it likely saved other lives, he's ruling it a justifiable homicide in defense of others. Case closed." Thomas absorbed that information silently. Justice, he was learning, wasn't always black and white. Sometimes it was messy and complicated, served in darkness by desperate people who had no other choice. "What about my property?" he asked. "The cellar? You're free to do whatever you want with it," Webb said. "Though if I were you, I'd tear that structure down completely, salt the earth, and build something new in its place. Some places hold onto darkness too tightly to ever really be clean again." Thomas nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that, about what this place needs." The sheriff lit his pipe, smoke curling up toward the barn rafters. "And what's that?" "Not running away from what happened," Thomas said. "Not pretending it never existed, or trying to bury it deeper, but maybe transforming it, using this land for something good, something that honors the victims instead of hiding their memory." Over the next weeks, Thomas began that transformation. He did tear down the root cellar, dismantling it stone by stone with his own hands. It was hard, punishing work that left his muscles aching and his hands blistered, but something about the physical labor felt right, like penance or purification. When the last stone had been hauled away, he planted wildflower seeds in the disturbed earth, choosing varieties that would bloom from spring through fall. Copper watched this work with what Thomas could only describe as approval, grazing nearby while he labored, occasionally wandering over to nuzzle his shoulder as if to encourage him. Where Jacob's grave had been, Thomas erected a simple marker, not for Jacob himself, but for his victims. He carved 3 names into a wooden cross: Samuel Morrison, William Chen, and below them, Unknown Traveller. Beneath the names he added, "May you find in death the peace you were denied in life." Word spread through Millbrook about what Thomas was doing, and people's attitude toward him began to shift. At first, they'd viewed him as either foolishly brave or dangerously curious for opening that cellar. But as they learned how he'd handled the aftermath, insisting on identifying the victims, honoring their memory, and transforming the site of horror into something peaceful, respect grew. Walter Hayes from the general store was the first to visit, bringing supplies Thomas hadn't ordered. "On the house," the old shopkeeper said gruffly. "Figure a man doing what you're doing deserves some support." Others followed. A widow named Martha Sullivan brought fresh bread and preserves. A farmer named Joe Richardson offered to help with the heavy work of clearing fields for spring planting. Even Ida Pritchard, the nervous land agent, stopped by to apologize for not being more forthcoming about the property's history. "I thought if people didn't talk about it, maybe it would just fade away," she admitted, standing on Thomas's porch with a basket of apples from her own trees. "But you've shown us that some things need to be faced head-on, brought into the light where they can be properly grieved and released." Thomas accepted these gestures with quiet gratitude, understanding that what he was receiving wasn't just kindness to him personally, but the community's collective relief that their darkest secret had finally been acknowledged and could now begin to heal. One evening in late November, as the first real winter snow began to fall, Thomas sat on his porch, wrapped in a heavy coat, watching Copper graze in the near pasture. The mare had put on weight since they'd arrived, her coat glossy and thick for winter, her movements content and relaxed. The fear she'd carried during those first days was completely gone, replaced by the calm demeanor of a horse who knew she was home. Thomas thought about his wife then, really let himself remember her without the protective numbness that had surrounded those memories for so long. Ellen had been a practical woman, strong and clear-headed, the kind of person who faced problems directly instead of avoiding them. She would have approved of what he'd done here, he realized. Not the buying of a cursed property, perhaps, but the way he'd handled what he'd found, the choice to expose truth rather than bury it deeper. The decision to transform horror into something meaningful. "You would have liked it here," he said quietly to the falling snow, to her memory, to the ghost of the life they'd shared. "Once we'd cleaned it up, I mean. Good land, good bones to the house. Room for a garden. You always wanted more space for a garden." The words hung in the cold air, and Thomas felt something shift inside his chest. Not the hollow ache that had lived there for 2 years, but something different. Something that felt almost like peace, or at least the beginning of it. He wasn't healed, would probably never be fully healed from the loss of his wife and daughter. But he was learning to carry that grief differently, to let it exist alongside hope instead of drowning out everything else. Movement in the pasture caught his eye. Copper had stopped grazing and was looking toward the road, ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm. A wagon was approaching, moving slowly through the gathering dusk. Thomas stood, hand moving instinctively to check that his coffee pot was still warm in case he had visitors. The wagon pulled up to his gate, and a woman climbed down, pulling her shawl tight against the snow. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair streaked with premature grey and eyes that had seen too much hardship. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9, sat in the wagon bed, watching Thomas with solemn curiosity. "Mr. Brennan?" the woman called. "I'm Thomas," he confirmed, walking down from the porch. "Can I help you?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My name is Catherine Morrison. Samuel Morrison was my father. The sheriff wrote to my mother about what you found, what you did. She asked me to come thank you in person, but she died last month before she could make the journey, so I came instead." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Both losses." Catherine wiped her eyes with a worn handkerchief. "We spent 12 years not knowing, always wondering if maybe he'd just decided to leave us, start over somewhere new. Mother never remarried because she held on to hope he might come back. It nearly destroyed her, that not knowing. She took a shaky breath. Learning what really happened, that he didn't abandon us, that he was murdered by a madman. It's terrible knowledge, but it's better than the wondering. And knowing that someone cared enough to give him back his name, to mark what happened with dignity and respect, that matters more than I can say. Thomas didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded. Catherine looked past him toward the property, toward the fields going white with snow and the warm light glowing from the farmhouse windows. The sheriff said you've made this place into something good again, that you're planning to stay, work the land, maybe take in travelers who need a place to rest. That's the idea, Thomas confirmed. Seems like the right thing to do. Turn a place of death into a place of hospitality. The boy in the wagon spoke up then, his voice high and clear in the cold air. Mama says sometimes the worst places can become the best places if the right person finds them. Thomas smiled at that wisdom from such a young mouth. Your mama's a smart woman. Catherine reached into her coat and pulled out a small package wrapped in cloth. This was my father's. A compass he always carried. I want you to have it as thanks for what you did. Thomas tried to protest, but she pressed it into his hands firmly. Please, she said, let it guide you the way you've helped guide us toward peace. She climbed back into the wagon, gathering the reins. As she turned the horses toward the road, she called back, You're doing good work here, Mr. Brennan. Don't let anyone tell you different. Thomas watched the wagon disappear into the swirling snow, then looked down at the compass in his hand. It was old brass, worn smooth by years of handling, the needle still pointing true north, despite everything it had witnessed. He walked back to the porch where Copper had come to stand, her warm bulk a comforting presence beside him. Well, girl, he said, stroking her neck, looks like we're exactly where we're supposed to be. The mare waffled softly, her breath steaming in the cold air, and Thomas could have sworn she was agreeing with him. That night, for the first time since his wife died, Thomas slept soundly through until morning. No nightmares, no restless tossing, just deep, dreamless sleep in a house that no longer felt haunted by other people's horrors. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the fields in clean white silence, burying the past under layers of new possibility. And in the barn, Copper dozed peacefully in her stall, the faithful horse who'd known from the very beginning that some secrets needed to be uncovered before healing could begin. Some doors needed to be opened, no matter how many chains were wrapped around them, so that light could finally reach the darkness within. Winter settled over the Illinois prairie like a thick blanket, bringing with it the kind of cold that made your bones ache and your breath freeze in your beard. But inside the farmhouse that had once been the Whitmore property, warmth and purpose had taken root. Thomas spent those long winter months doing what needed to be done to make the place truly livable. He repaired the sagging porch, replaced broken window panes, patched holes in the roof where rain had been seeping through for years. Each improvement felt like an act of reclamation, taking back space that darkness had occupied for too long. Copper thrived through the winter in a way that told Thomas he'd made the right choice. The mare had a thick shelter, plenty of hay, and the kind of contentment that only comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. On clear nights, Thomas would stand in the barn doorway and watch her, the way she moved through her space with confidence and calm, no longer starting at shadows or refusing to approach certain areas. Animals knew things. He'd always believed that. And if Copper had made peace with this place, then so could he. Word continued to spread about the transformation happening at what folks had started calling the Brennan Farm instead of the cursed Whitmore place. That shift in name felt significant, like the land itself was being given permission to start over with a clean slate. In February, Thomas received a letter from William Chen's family in San Francisco. It was written in careful English by Chen's younger sister, who explained that their family had hired investigators for 3 years trying to find William, never giving up hope that he might still be alive somewhere. Learning of his death had been crushing, But learning that someone had cared enough to identify him, to give him a marked resting place and dignity in death, had brought her elderly parents comfort in their final years. She included a photograph of William, young and hopeful, standing beside mining equipment before he'd headed east, seeking his fortune. Thomas framed that photograph and hung it in his front room, alongside a small portrait of Samuel Morrison that Catherine had sent him. The unknown traveller remained nameless, but Thomas placed an empty frame on the wall for him too, a placeholder for a life that mattered even if history had forgotten his name. These weren't decorations. They were witnesses, reminders of why this work mattered. As winter began loosening its grip and the first hints of spring appeared in the lengthening days, Thomas made plans for the farm's future. He would grow wheat and corn, enough to support himself and have surplus to sell. But he would also keep several rooms in the house ready for travellers, offering meals and shelter to those passing through, especially those who looked like they were running from something or toward something with equal desperation. He understood that impulse now, the need to keep moving, because staying still meant facing things you weren't ready to face. If he could offer people a safe place to rest, to catch their breath, maybe some of them would find what he'd found here. Not answers necessarily, but the courage to stop running. In late March, his first guest arrived, a young man named David Pierce, maybe 22 years old, thin as a rail, and carrying everything he owned in a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He'd been walking for 3 days from Springfield, he said, looking for farm work anywhere he could find it. Thomas fed him beef stew and fresh bread, then showed him to one of the upstairs rooms he'd prepared. "You can stay as long as you need," Thomas said. "I could use help with spring planting if you're willing to work for room and board plus a small wage." David's eyes filled with tears. "You don't even know me. Why would you trust me?" Thomas thought about that question, about trust and second chances, and the way one person's kindness could redirect the entire course of another person's life. "Because someone trusted me once when they didn't have to," he said simply. "And because everyone deserves a place where they can figure out who they want to be." David stayed for 3 months, helping Thomas plant crops, repair more of the property's infrastructure, and build a proper shelter for copper, with space for additional horses if they acquired them. The young man worked hard, ate well, and slowly the haunted look in his eyes faded. He talked sometimes about the father who'd beaten him, the town he'd fled, the fear that he'd never amount to anything. Thomas listened without judgment, shared what wisdom he'd learned about grief and guilt and the hard work of healing, and trusted that David would find his own path forward. When David finally left in June, heading west with money in his pocket and confidence in his step, he shook Thomas's hand firmly and said, "You saved my life. You know that, right?" Thomas shook his head. "No, I just gave you a safe place to save yourself. There's a difference." Other travelers followed. A widow fleeing an abusive son-in-law, a former soldier who couldn't settle back into civilian life, a teenage girl running from an arranged marriage she didn't want. Thomas took them all in, asked no questions they didn't volunteer to answer, and provided what they needed most, time and space to breathe without judgment or pressure. The farm developed a reputation, passed along in whispered conversations at trading posts and general stores. If you needed help and had nowhere else to turn, head to the Brennan farm near Millbrook. The man there understands about needing a second chance. By the summer of 1884, exactly 1 year after Thomas had first set foot on the cursed property, the transformation was complete. The fields grew thick with wheat that rippled like water in the wind. The house stood straight and proud, fresh white paint gleaming in the sun. Wildflowers bloomed where the root cellar had been, a riot of color that brought butterflies and bees and the simple beauty of life continuing despite everything. The memorial marker for the 3 victims stood clean and well-tended, fresh flowers placed there regularly by people from town who wanted to acknowledge lives lost and remembered. Thomas had planted 3 oak saplings nearby, young trees that would outlive him and everyone else who knew this story, standing as living monuments when all the humans involved had turned to dust. On the anniversary of his arrival, Thomas threw a barn-raising party, though there was no barn to raise. It was really just an excuse to gather the community, to celebrate how far they'd all come in confronting and healing from the darkness that had lived among them. Half the town showed up, bringing food and music and children who played in the yard without fear, sensing nothing sinister in the land their parents had once avoided. Walter Hayes brought his fiddle. Martha Sullivan organized the women in setting up tables laden with pies and roasted chickens and fresh vegetables. Sheriff Webb came with his wife, spending the afternoon in easy conversation, the weight of last year's investigation finally lifted from his shoulders. As the sun set and lanterns were lit around the yard, Thomas found himself standing near Copper's paddock, watching his neighbors dance and laugh and simply enjoy being alive. The mare came to stand beside him, pushing her soft nose into his hand. "We did all right, didn't we, girl?" he murmured, scratching behind her ears the way she liked. "You knew what needed to happen, and you made sure I found it." Copper nickered softly, and Thomas smiled. He'd come to this place broken and hollow, seeking nothing more than isolation and cheap land. What he'd found instead was purpose, community, and the understanding that healing wasn't something you did alone. It required witness, required bringing secrets into the light, required the courage to face terrible truths, and then choosing to build something better from the wreckage. He thought about his wife and daughter, let their memory wash over him without the sharp pain that had once accompanied any thought of them. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer consumed him. He'd learned to carry it alongside joy, letting both exist in the same heart. "Thomas!" Martha called from the porch, waving him over. "Come tell these folks about your plans for the winter shelter." He'd been developing an idea, a way to expand the farm's mission during the brutal prairie winters when travelers were most vulnerable. A separate building where people could stay for weeks or even months if needed, with a communal kitchen and space for skills training. He wanted to teach people what he knew about farming, animal husbandry, basic carpentry, skills that could help them make fresh starts wherever they ended up. As he walked toward the porch to explain his vision, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone trying to outrun pain, but the steady, solid hope of someone who'd walked through darkness and come out the other side with purpose intact. The party continued late into the night, firelight dancing across faces young and old, stories being shared, connections being forged. At one point, Thomas noticed a stranger standing at the edge of the property line, a young woman with a baby on her hip and fear in her eyes. He recognized that look. He'd worn it himself once. He walked over slowly, keeping his movements calm and unthreatening. "Evening, miss. I'm Thomas Brennan. This is my farm. You look like you could use a warm meal and a safe place to rest." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I heard about this place. Heard you help people who need helping." "That's right," Thomas confirmed. "No questions asked, no judgments made. You're welcome here." She took a shaky breath, hugging her baby closer. "My husband, I had to leave. I've been walking for 2 days. Don't have nowhere else to go." Thomas gestured toward the house. "Well, you're somewhere now. Come on inside. Let's get you and that baby fed and settled. Everything else can wait until tomorrow." As he led her toward the warmth and light and community gathered on his porch, Thomas felt Copper's presence, even though the mare was out of sight in her paddock. That faithful horse, who'd sensed truth before he did, who'd refused to let him ignore what needed to be found, who'd been his companion through the hardest parts of this journey. Some people might say it was just coincidence, just a horse being skittish on strange land. But Thomas knew better. Copper had understood from the very beginning that some secrets were too heavy to stay buried, that healing required excavation and exposure, and the willingness to face whatever horrors lay beneath the surface. The farm that had once been known only for darkness and whispers was now a beacon for people seeking light. The land that had soaked up blood and horror had been redeemed through simple acts of kindness and stubborn refusal to let evil have the final word. And the widower who'd bought a cursed property for $250, seeking only isolation and cheap acreage, had found instead his life's true calling. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Thomas stood on his porch and looked out at the land he'd claimed and cleaned and made holy through hard work and honest confrontation with its past. This was his legacy now, not the family he'd lost, though he'd never forget them, but this place of transformation and second chances. Years later, long after Thomas Brennan had passed and been buried in the small cemetery near town, the farm continued operating as he'd envisioned. It was run by people whose lives he'd touched, who carried forward his understanding that redemption was always possible, and that every person deserved a place where they could rest, heal, and become whoever they were meant to be. The 3 oak trees grew tall and strong, shading the wildflower meadow where darkness had once lived. Travelers still stopped there, drawn by reputation and rumor, finding refuge and kindness. And in the barn, though no horse could match Copper's particular wisdom, each animal that lived there seemed to carry something of her legacy. That knowing quality, that ability to sense when someone needed saving. The story became legend in that part of Illinois, told and retold until fact and embellishment blurred together. But the heart of it remained true. A broken man and a faithful horse had uncovered buried evil, brought it into the light, and transformed a place of horror into a sanctuary. Some said on quiet nights you could still see them, Thomas and Copper, walking the fence line together, checking on things, making sure the land stayed honest and the mission stayed true. Whether that was truth or just hopeful imagination didn't really matter. What mattered was that people kept coming, kept finding safety, kept learning that their past didn't have to define their future. What mattered was that darkness had been faced and defeated not through violence or vengeance, but through the simple, stubborn choice to build something good in the exact place where evil had tried to take root. And what mattered most of all was the lesson Thomas Brennan had learned and passed on to everyone who walked through his door, that healing begins when you stop running, that truth is better than comfortable ignorance, and that sometimes the most cursed places can become the most blessed if someone has the courage to unlock what's been chained away and let light flood into the darkest corners. The farm stands still even now, a testament to the power of one person choosing to face rather than flee, to heal rather than hide, to trust in the possibility of redemption even when every rational voice says some places are too far gone to save. Thomas Brennan proved them wrong, and his legacy, built on 250s, a faithful horse, and the courage to open doors that everyone else feared, continues to prove them wrong every single day. Thank you for staying with me through this incredible journey of transformation and redemption. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button and join our community of listeners who believe in second chances and the power of facing our darkest truths. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had an experience where facing something difficult led to unexpected healing? Have you known someone who transformed a bad situation into something beautiful? Share your stories with us, because every story of redemption inspires someone else who needs to hear it. And here's my question for you. What's the most important lesson you're taking away from Thomas and Copper's story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Until next time, remember that no place is too dark to be filled with light, and no past is too heavy to be transformed into purpose. Keep facing forward, keep choosing courage, and keep believing in the possibility of redemption.